After 1 d4, your average Queen's Gambit declined Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian player tends to be a fairly solid character. They will play slightly inferior positions for hours in the hope that you'll blunder from boredom. What they won't be ready for is a direct frontal attack against their king. This is where our white repertoire will really kick in. On the surface, white's setup is unassuming, but by the time black realises, it may well be too late to save himself. I will be presenting a complete repertoire for white after d4, d5, involving the Collie Zukertort system. Against the Nimzo Queen's Indian complex, I will be suggesting the classical system. For the unprepared opponent, white's setup could simply prove too hot to handle.
So, we will be starting by looking at the Collie Zukertort system, which starts after d4. Black's main response will be d5. White plays knight f3. Black plays knight f6. And white plays e2 to e3, introducing a Collie setup. Black's main response is e6. White plays bishop d3. And now black, if he's to achieve any meaningful counterplay on white's centre, is at some stage, he may as well do it now, play the move c7 to c5. If he doesn't do it now, it's extremely likely he will do it in the near future. Now white plays the move b2 to b3. Black's last move contained a threat of c5 to c4, and this move stops the pawn moving to c4, but more than that, it prepares to fianchetto white's bishop on b2. With the bishop on b2, both bishops are taking aim at the black king side. White will be looking for opportunities to release the power of both bishops against the black king side, with perhaps d4 takes c5 at some stage. I'm going to demonstrate now what white's basic attacking scheme is. I'm not going to give black any moves at this stage. Bishop b2. Castles. Knight e5. f4. Knight d2. And now, depending on how black has defended himself, either queen f3 over to h3 is one idea, or rook f3 over to h3 is another. Alternatively, white can seek to release the power of the bishop on b2 against black's kingside by playing d takes c5 at some stage. This is really white's ideal attacking formation, and as you can see, white's position is still very, very solid. It's not easy to spot a weakness in the white position at this stage, but white has a nice attacking game. For the real bloodthirsty player, they may also consider g2 to g4, followed by g5, chasing away a key defender from the king side. In fact, it was the removal of this piece, the knight on f6, that led to catastrophe for black in the game that I'm now going to show you. Returning to our basic Collie Zukertort structure after 5b3, in Kano vs Perez, Mesa 1993, play developed as follows. Black played b6, white played bishop b2, black played bishop e7, white castled, black castled, white played knight b d2. So at the moment we can see white playing all the moves we just looked at a second ago. He's now getting ready to play the move knight f3 to e5, which frees his queen's advance into black's position and the advance of the f-pawn. Black played bishop b7 and white played knight e5. We'll see black has a number of defensive setups against the Collie Zukertort system. The beauty of the Collie Zukertort system, however, is that the theory is easy to remember. White usually sets up the same attacking formation against whatever defensive formation black chooses. I'm going to concentrate on the methods of conducting the attack against each defensive system. To whet your appetite, I've put this game in. Black played knight c6. And white played another common move in the Colli-Zucchius system, the move a2 to a3, which at first sight looks a little strange. Why isn't white just getting on with it on the king side? Forget about the queen side. Well, this move actually comes in useful in quite a few lines of the Colli-Zucchius. Black could, at some stage, annoy white by moving the knight from c6 to b4. This would force the bishop away from its most natural attacking diagonal, so we play this move a2 to a3 to prevent any chance of that. Black continued queen c7, f4, rook a c8, rook f3. This is one of white's possible attacking formations here. Now, black is fully developed in this position. In fact, you wouldn't believe that disaster is about to strike from a seemingly clear sky. But black's next move was really a huge mistake. Black played knight from f6 to d7, removing the key defender that I was talking about earlier, of his own volition, really. After knight f6 to d7, I wonder if you can spot white's winning coup. White played bishop takes h7 check. Always a move to watch out for in the Colli-Zucchius system. And black played king h8. Let's just see what happens if black was to take the bishop on h7. If king takes h7, white would play rook h3 check, king g8, queen h5, and black can't do anything about the threat of queen h8 checkmate. So, quite a nice game to start off with. Of course, black didn't defend particularly accurately, but he didn't do anything incredibly badly wrong either. I mean, he developed his pieces. However, just removing one key piece from the king side was enough to send white's attack crashing through. I now want to examine two of black's major options at this stage. First is when black plays a passive setup based on the moves knight b d7 and bishop e7. And I will then go on to examine a more aggressive setup for black, where black puts the knight on c6 and the bishop on d6. Okay, so after black plays knight b d7, white should play bishop b2. Nothing's changed. We play the same attacking formation against virtually any black defensive system. Black plays bishop e7. White castles. We've seen all this before. Black castles. White plays knight b d2. And black plays b6. It's hard to imagine how black will complete his development without playing this move. Obviously, the bishop on c8 has to move. And now in this position, we should carry on as usual with the move knight f3 to e5. After knight e5, black has a choice. Black can capture on e5 immediately, or black can delay this capture for the time being. In the game Hartston against Upton from London 1984, black played bishop b7, and white now introduced a slightly different attacking idea to one we've seen before. Previously we've looked at the move f2 to f4. The nice thing about the Colli-Zucchius system is that you have great versatility in the way you arrange your attack. Here white played the move queen from d1 to f3. Now normally this means that the queen is going to be swinging over, as it does in this game, to the h3 square. Black continued With development, rook c8. The c-file is likely to become open at some stage, so black prepares for that at this stage. And white played queen h3. This introduces another tactic familiar to Kolizuke players. Perhaps you can see what white is threatening in this position. White is threatening knight takes d7. Now, black cannot recapture with the knight on f6 because it's mate on h7. But this should bring to your attention an idea if you haven't seen it at this stage, because after queen takes d7, I spoke before about the possibility of releasing this bishop on b2 against the black king. Here is an extremely appropriate moment. D takes c5. This simply wins a pawn for white, because if black recaptures with b takes c5, white plays bishop takes f6, and it's all over. Black can plough on with a move like g6, but he's a whole piece down in this position. Losing a pawn would be the lesser of two evils. Black could defend his kingside by a move such as h6 or g6 at this stage, but was probably reluctant to weaken his kingside structure at such an early stage. So black decided now was the time to get rid of this annoying knight on e5. Black took it off. Knight takes e5. And, of course, white recaptured. D takes e5. Now, the black knight really short of squares to move to in this position. If the knight moves anywhere apart from e4, it's mate yet again on h7. So the knight moved into e4. This was black's idea all along. Black, after, say, a response such as f3, is hoping that knight g5 will hold his defences for the time being. But Hartston didn't play this. White played rook a d1. A very sensible move. White's rook on d1 is now on the same line as black's queen on d8, facilitating tactics along the file. Black played knight g5, removing the knight from harm's way. White continued with queen h5, and black can no longer tolerate the pressure on the pawn on h7, as I suspect many of your opponents won't, and played the move g7 to g6. This was going to happen at some stage. White now, the queen has done her work, retreated the queen back to e2 to a more central position. But if black thought that white's attack was over at this stage, he was fundamentally wrong. After queen e2, black played another normal developing move, queen c7. And white played a very interesting move here, the move c2 to c4. It looks like white is starting to play on the queen side, but white has an extremely cunning idea. Black now decided he wanted to cement his knight in on e4 should it return there, and also to give it another square. So black played the move f7 to f5. And white, surprisingly it might seem, encouraged black on his way with the move f2 to f4. This does seem strange because it allows black to play the move knight g5 to e4. Well, it was very tempting for black to do this, of course. It seems that the black knight is now firmly entrenched on the square e4. However, appearances in this case certainly are deceptive, and white now revealed his cunning plan. He played the move c4 takes d5. Black played e6 takes d5, what could be more natural? But now we see that the bishop on b2 again can come into the game along this long diagonal should the pawn on e5 move. And it was this point that enabled Hartston in this position to play knight on d2 takes e4. Not an amazing move in itself. If d takes e4, bishop c4 check, black's king has to move, it doesn't matter where, g7 or h8, it's the same, let's say h8. White plays rook d7. We're about to see this idea in another guise in a second, which picks up the black bishop on e7 at the very least, because if queen takes rook, then this bishop on b2 comes into the game again. e5 to e6 check, picks up the black queen. Black's position is in ruins. So black in the game played f5 takes e4, and white now played bishop takes e4. Now at this point, after bishop takes e4, black played rook f d8, defending the pawn on d5, and went on to lose. Let's just see what would have happened if black had played d takes e4. It's very similar to the previous line, in fact. White plays queen c4 check, king h8, rook d7, queen c6, rook takes e7, regains the piece with an extra pawn to boot. Also, black's king is looking extremely shaky in this position. Alternatively, if queen takes rook, well, we've seen this before, e5 to e6 check, picks up the queen. Black has one last alternative after queen c4 check we should examine, which is rook f7. But the same ideas apply again. White should play e6. Black must move the rook if he doesn't want to lose it. Rook, say, to f8. It really doesn't matter very much. And now, yet again, rook d7. Black has no good way to save both the queen on c7 and the bishop on e7. It's really the end. Returning to our basic Colli-Zuckert position. One of my games continued from this point. Bishop e7, bishop b2, black castled, I castled, black played knight b d7. Again, you'll notice that black's move order is extremely flexible, but it really doesn't alter white's attacking plan. However black develops his pieces, white's plan stays the same. Knight b d2. And again, black chose to fianchetto his bishop, b7 to b6, perfectly natural move. Knight e5, but unlike the game Hartston versus Upton, black now chose to eliminate the knight straight away before it could cause any more trouble. So black played the move knight on d7, takes the knight on e5. Well, of course, I recaptured with d4 takes e5. And black retreated his knight back to d7. I played the supporting move f2 to f4, and black developed his bishop. Bishop from c8 to b7. At this point, I became concerned that black might free himself in the near future by playing the move f7 to f6. Now, while this wouldn't be a disaster for white's attacking options, it was a move I wanted to prevent. So I played the move queen from d1 to h5. Again, we haven't really seen this before. There's an obvious threat of taking the pawn on h7. And black chose to prevent this again by the move g7 to g6. Probably the reason black is avoiding the move h7 to h6 is that white could now unleash one of the plans I was talking about earlier of trundling the g-pawn up the board with g2 to g4, followed by g5. Black's king side is beginning to look very shaky indeed. So black played the more solid move g7 to g6. And now, if I do say so myself, I played quite a clever move. I played the move queen h5 to h3. The idea behind this move is, again, to restrict black's possibilities. I would like to prevent my opponent from freeing himself with either f6 or perhaps blocking things up with f5. Of course, both those moves at the moment are not possible because of the weakness of the pawn on e6. Here my opponent, Mr. Jimenez, in the Andorra Open, completely surprised me with his next move. Probably he was worried about White's attacking possibilities on the king side, hoping to break through with perhaps g2 to g4, followed by f4 to f5, when the threat of f6 is in the air as well. So he decided that active measures were necessary to combat White's growing initiative on the king side, and so he struck out on the queen side. I must admit I had not been looking at that side of the board at all, and when he played the move b6 to b5, I wondered what on earth was going on. And after bishop takes b5, I think this is the most accurate move, Black revealed his idea, queen a5. So he's attacking both my bishop on b5 and the knight on d2 at the same time. Well, I have very little option now. I must take. Bishop takes d7. And Black played queen takes d2. So Black's given up a pawn. What has he got for it? Well, I think his idea was that my bishop on d7 would now be able to play no future active role in the game for quite a few moves. It certainly doesn't seem to be doing much of a job on the king side anymore. The black pawns on e6 and d5 locking it out of the game. But unfazed by this, I continued rook f2, kicking the queen back into touch. My opponent played queen b4. I decided to kick the queen again with a2 to a3. By now I had seen my plan, and I didn't want the queen interfering along the fifth rank. Black played queen b6, and it was here that I unleashed my idea. I played the spectacular looking move f4 to f5. Well, if this move looks spectacular, the next one is even more so. Black, anxious to keep the white bishop out of the game, played g6 takes f5. After e takes f5, the response would have been the same. Rook takes f5. That's a whole rook sacrifice. Well, if Black ignores the rook sacrifice, White has various very nice attacking ideas, such as rook from f5 to h5. And it seems likely it's going to be checkmate in the very near future. Black felt he could not, therefore, ignore this rook. He played e takes f5. Bishop takes f5. And now, a familiar theme in the Colli-Zuckert system, White is threatening mate yet again on h7. Well, Black really doesn't have many options in this position. If he moves his rook, say, to e8, it does not help, or d8. White will simply play queen takes h7 check, king f8, queen h8, checkmate. So Black played really his only move in this position, h7 to h6. And at this point, I brought the bishop on b2 into the game. I told you should make use of every opportunity you can to do this. And at the same time, I blocked the queen on b6's defence of the pawn on h6 with the move e5 to e6. Now White is simply threatening queen takes pawn on h6, which is going to be checkmate in the very near future. My opponent played bishop g5. This is the only sensible way to defend the pawn on h6. Now my bishop on b2 got in on the act. I played bishop b2 to f6, threatening simply just to take his bishop and then checkmate as normal. My opponent decided he couldn't sit idly by while this happened. If he makes the move bishop takes f6, I will simply play queen takes h6, threatening queen h7 checkmate. The only way he can avoid this is by playing rook anywhere along his first rank, say b8 for example, but then queen h7 check, king f8, queen takes f7, checkmate. My opponent played f takes e6. I played bishop takes e6 check. Now if the king moves to the h-file, say king h7, then queen f5 is yet again quite a nice checkmate. So again my opponent's response was forced. Rook f7. I played bishop takes bishop on g5. Pawn takes bishop. And now my final piece entered the attack with decisive effect. Rook from a1 to f1. Well, black doesn't again have much choice. His choice is really strictly limited in this game. He played rook from a8 to f8. And now the killer blow. Not a huge swap on f7, but the move rook from f1 to f6. Black resigned. He's defenceless against the threat of rook f6 to g6. Checkmate. Black has another, more aggressive way to set up his pieces. He can play the move 5 knight c6. White castles. Black plays bishop d6. Black can combine this with an idea to either push forward in the centre with e6 to e5, or simple development with castles b6, bishop b7. In this system you have to be slightly more careful as white as to exactly how you develop your pieces in order not to allow black to equalise too easily. After bishop d6, white should play bishop b2. And now black has a choice. Black can either just continue with simple castling, but the move I want to look at first is the move queen c7. This is quite a sneaky move by black. What black's doing with this move is preventing us from carrying out our most natural plan of knight to e5. Therefore, in this position, it's important for white to take a new approach. Otherwise, black also may be able to play the move e6 to e5 himself in the very near future. So, I'm going to recommend here the move c2 to c4, combating black in the centre before he gets his own central break in. Now, this is quite a committal decision by white, because black, if he wishes, can give white hanging pawns in this position by c5 takes d4, e3 takes d4, d5 takes c4, and now white should play b3 takes c4. Important thing to notice from white's point of view about this position is that your bishop on b2 can still become a very important attacking piece. In fact, you should be constantly looking for opportunities to play d4 to d5 to release this bishop along the long diagonal a1 to h8. There are very few black players who would be willing to undertake the strategical problems that this position presents for them. In fact, a very similar position was reached in Sieg Beckus, Germany 1989, with the one difference that the queen was on e7. At least with the queen on e7, the knight on f6 is more securely defended. I'll just show you this game now to present some of the ideas that white can undertake in this sort of variation with the hanging pawns. Black in this position played knight b4. White retreated, bishop e2. The knight's not going to stay on b4 for very long, of course. It will be kicked by a3 in the near future. Black played bishop d7, developing. White rook e1, putting the rook on the same file as black's queen and king. Black played rook c8. White kicked the knight back now with a3. Black played knight c6. White played bishop d3. Again, both bishops now are ready to rake towards the black king. Black castled. He can't put it off forever, and besides, white is now getting ready for the move d4 to d5 with a vengeance. White actually played queen d2 here. Probably he has ideas of perhaps bringing the queen over to g5, helping the white attack, especially in conjunction with this bishop on b2. So black now got his queen off the critical file with the move queen d8. White now played a standard move, knight f3 to e5. And black set about attacking white's pawns on the queen side with the move knight c6 to a5. Also, black is hoping to land on the b3 square, which at this moment would win the exchange. So white not unnaturally played the move queen e3 here. The knight on b3 can be tolerated in this position because after knight b3 there would be some tactics arising after bishop takes h7 check, and white could pick up this knight on b3. So black played the move a6. If black cannot win the pawn on c4, normally he's trying to exchange it, which would leave in a position where both the c pawn and the b pawn had been removed. White would leave white with an isolated pawn on d4, which black could hope to exploit. So white finally moved his queen's knight with the move knight d2. Black played b5, very logically. And now white took his opportunity. He played the move knight takes d7. Black, anxious to leave a defender of his kingside, played the move queen takes d7 rather than knight takes, although perhaps it would have been better in that position to actually take with the knight. Because what happens next is a good illustration of the power of the two bishops and the sort of thing you should be watching out for when you play this variation. White now played his thematic advance d4 to d5. Black took a pawn on the queen side, knight takes c4. White recaptured with knight takes c4. Black recaptured, b takes c4. White now launched in with bishop takes f6. Now, black can't afford to take the bishop on d3 with c takes d3 because queen g5 and the end is nigh for black. So instead, black has to recapture with g takes f6. But now bishop takes h7 check. Again, another standard sacrifice in this sort of position. Well, black could decline the sacrifice, but his king's in a pretty sorry state anyway. King h8 can be met by queen h3, for example. So black decided he may as well have a piece for his trouble with king takes bishop. But now came queen h3 check, king g7, queen g4 check, king h7, and now white swung a rook over. Rook e3. Black is powerless against white's oncoming attack. He tried the move bishop f4. White could simply take that if he wished, but he found perhaps the more accurate move rook h3 check, and black resigns. A likely continuation, bishop h6, queen h5, and black can do nothing about the threat of queen takes h6 check. King moves, and then either queen h7 or queen h8, checkmate. There's one final thing I want to say about the line with queen c7. That is, after c4, if black ignores the pawn structure for the moment and still carries on with his plan to play e5 anyway, for instance after castles knight bd2, black could try the move e5 in this position, again striking back in the centre. But there's a problem with it in this position. White would play c4 takes d5. Black plays knight takes d5. White plays d takes e5. Black plays knight takes e5. White plays knight takes e5. Black plays bishop takes e5. And just at the point that black thinks he's getting easy equality, comes another tactical shot. Bishop takes h7 check. If the king moves, black simply lost a pawn, but if the king takes the bishop, black loses a pawn anyway, after queen h5 check, picking up the bishop on e5. Black simply can't be so ambitious so early in the opening. Going back to the position after bishop b2, as queen c7 doesn't seem to fare very well against the accurate response c4, when the queen is missed from the king side, black players normally choose the move castles kingside. White found a very interesting idea in the game Crab vs Depet Aegon 1992. White played the move knight e5, which is fairly standard, and after queen c7, White supported the knight with f2 to f4. White's idea was revealed after black continued developing normally in this position with the move b7 to b6. In fact, this is almost a losing move already. White played knight takes c6. Black played queen takes c6. And White once again unleashed the powerful bishop on b2 by playing d takes c5. Well, strangely enough, black's best move here may well be to admit he's made a mistake and put his bishop back on e7 here. In fact, that's probably the only chance black has to even remotely stay in the game at this point. However, black played the very natural move bishop takes c5, which on the face of it looks extremely good for black. But now White's attack came crashing through. White played bishop takes f6. If you get a chance to play this, this is normally a very worthwhile move because you shatter black's kingside pawn formation, and the bishop on d3 gives you additional attacking chances on the king side. Black could take the pawn on e3 in this position, but as we'll see, it makes very, very little difference if he takes this or not. In fact, in the game, black took this pawn a little while later and could quite easily transpose. You'll see it makes very little difference. After g takes f6, as played in the game, black was probably hoping to defend after a move such as queen h5 by the move f5. But black got no second chance in this game. White crashed through yet again. Bishop takes h7 check. Again, black could ignore that, but it really won't make very much difference in the long term. For instance, king h8, queen h5. White's attack is crashing through. And if instead king g7, queen g4 check will be very similar to the game. So black took, king takes h7. White played queen h5 check. King moved to g7, and we've seen this sort of idea before. Queen g4 check, king h7, rook f3. Exceedingly little black can do about the threat of rook h3 checkmate. He tried a spite check, bishop takes e3, perhaps hoping for rook takes e3, queen c5, starving off mate for the moment. But of course, white's not interested in the bishop. White played king h1, and black resigned. For instance, after bishop takes f4, white will not be distracted. Rook h3 check, bishop h6, and queen h5. We've seen this all before. Checkmate in 2 more moves. We've seen in many lines now that the release of the bishop by means of the move d4 takes c5 can have a devastating effect upon black's position. For this reason, many strong players have played the move c5 takes d4 at some stage. This has advantages and disadvantages. Its advantages are, of course, that white can no longer, after the recapture e3 takes d4, capture a pawn on c5 to release his bishop. However, it does make it easier for white now to play the move knight f3 to e5, which can be supported by a rook from f1 to e1 if necessary. The e5 square now becomes white's sole domain. Some players prefer to castle first with castles. White plays knight bd2. Knight e5, as we've seen, is also perfectly playable, but could transpose after c takes d4, which happens. E takes d4. Queen e7. Black is revealing his idea here. White plays knight e5 as normal. It's possible to prevent black's idea, but I don't think it's actually necessary. Black now reveals his idea with bishop a3. What black wants to do in this line is weaken white's queenside with a hope to exploiting any weaknesses created thereby later. But this does give white a freer hand on the king side. This can perhaps be considered one of the main lines of the Cole-Zuckert system, so it's worthwhile knowing what white should do. I recommend white should play bishop takes a3. Black plays queen takes a3. And now the move c2 to c3. This shores up white's pawn on d4 and prevents any annoying moves such as knight b4. On the minus side, white's pawn on c3 and potentially the pawn on a2 can be vulnerable to a black queen raid by means of queen b2 or queen a5. Practice has seen from this position black playing bishop d7, continuing development, queen d6, bringing the queen back to the centre of the action, and the pawn raid type move, queen a5. Queen d6 actually happened in one of my own games. I continued with f4 in my game against Thompson from Hastings in 1993. Black now played bishop d7. I played queen f3. And now black played quite a good defensive idea. He played his knight back to e7. And after queen h3, he brought his knight to g6. So black is being exceedingly cautious in this variation. He's shoring up his kingside against many of white's possible sacrificial continuations. So this is a very sensible continuation for black. I played rook f3 here, just building up my forces gradually. I couldn't see where black's counterplay was going to come from at the moment. It's one disadvantage of black's knight manoeuvre. It really does condemn black to a passive defence. Black played bishop c6. I now brought my other rook into the game with rook e1. Black played rook f e8. Now the continuation, bishop takes g6, looks quite dangerous for black. However, I couldn't make it quite work after h takes g6. Queen h8 check. King takes h8. Knight takes f7 check, seemingly winning a pawn. King g8. Knight takes d6. But I became concerned at this point that my knight on d6 was a bit short of squares, so I decided not to pursue this. So, I continued now with the move g2 to g4. Yet again, I wanted to try and chase away black's key defender of his kingside by means of the move g4 to g5. And sure enough, after rook a c8, I played the move g5. Now my idea here was, if black simply retreats with something like knight d7, was to continue building up my pieces on the kingside with the moves queen h5, maybe rook from e1 to f1, and then the other rook can come over to the h3 square. You can see that the pressure on black's kingside position is building and building, and this is quite a good illustration of what can happen to black if he plays too passively. So after the move g5, my opponent played knight e4. But this doesn't really solve all of black's opening problems. After knight takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, rook takes e4. White is simply a pawn up. Black can claim perhaps some compensation in view of the weakness of white's king, but I don't really feel this is enough. Going back to the position after knight e5, black chose the move queen a5 in Hofmeier versus Kraus, Germany 1993. White now played a good move, I feel, rook c1 in this position. This offers the pawn on a2, but then white's attack will kick in again with the usual moves f4, rook f3 to h3, etc. Black's queen will then be stranded away from the scene of the action on the kingside. Not surprisingly then, black decided not to accept this gift and to continue his development with the move bishop d7. But white's attack came anyway. f4, rook a c8, rook f3. This could all quite easily have happened with black's queen still on a2. Queen c7. Black is trying to bring his queen again back into the action area. White played rook c2. White's bishop on d3 now protects the rook on c2, so white was probably worried about black ideas, with the rook back on c1, of playing knight b4 at some stage, harassing the bishop on d3. The rook is on a more secure square on c2. So black played the move knight e7 here, borrowing an idea from the game Summerscale Thompson, to bring the knight towards the kingside where the action really is about to take place. White played rook h3. This introduces a new tactical idea in this position of bishop takes h7 check. Normally, in the lines we've discussed before, black's had to take that with the king. Now black can take with the knight, but black's still in trouble. White plays queen h5, and there's very little black can do about his knight on h7, and indeed a looming checkmate. If the knight moves, for instance, back to f6, then simply queen h8. Devastation. So, after rook h3, black must attend to his kingside. He played the move g6. White played g4. Black king g7. And white carried on. g5. Black retreated his knight now to g8. Of course, the knight could also move to h5. Probably black was worried about white's sacrificial possibilities. White normally doesn't need much encouragement in the Cole Zuccat, with rook takes h5, g takes h5, queen takes h5, with looming threats against the black king. So black played knight g8, and white now started swinging his queen into the action with the move queen e1. Black tried to stop this with knight f5, But white was fairly happy to exchange off his bishop now. If bishop takes f5, as it wasn't such an effective attacker anymore. E takes f5. And now queen h4. White, of course, threatening the pawn on h7. So black played the only move really to stop queen takes h7 check. h5. White took that en passant. The king moved to h7. And now white brought up his reserves. Knight d to f3. Threatening knight g5 check. Black defended with bishop e8. Probably, black would have liked to have played the move f6 in this position, but was quite possibly worried by knight takes g6 for white, and if king takes g6, h7. Not only is black's king in severe trouble, but white's threatening to make another queen in the near future. This explains bishop e8. Now black really is ready for f6, but he's out of time. White plays knight g5 check. King h8. h7. Black played knight f6. And now white rounded off a nice game with the move knight g takes f7 check. Black resigns. If bishop takes f7, queen takes f6, is checkmate. If rook takes f7, knight takes g6 check. King g7. h8 equals queen check. King takes g6. And now, well, you have a choice, but okay. Queen g5, checkmate. One final alternative for black in this position is simple development with bishop d7. As usual, white continues with f4. And black plays rook c8. We are following Grandmaster Carsten Hoy's game against Danielson from the Ringsted tournament in 1995. Well, you can probably guess what white's next few moves are by now. Rook f3. Black now decided not to wait for rook h3, but to play g6, anticipating white's attack. But after g6, white played the standard move again, queen e1. White is trying to take advantage of the new weaknesses on the dark squares around black's king. King g7, rook h3. Simple yet effective stuff this. Bishop e8. White again brought up the reserves. Knight d to f3. White now has 5 potential attackers on the king side. Black's king looking severely underprotected. Black tried rook h8, giving the h-pawn some extra protection. White changed tack slightly, brought his queen to d2 now. Knight e7. We've seen this defensive idea before. And we've seen white's attacking idea before. g2 to g4. It's not really dangerous for white to launch these kingside attacks because the centre is so stable. Black tried queen a5, counter-attacking against c3. And white played the standard rook c1 in response. Black now tried to swap bishops with bishop b5. White played bishop b1. Of course, white's not keen to exchange pieces when he's attacking. And black played h5. A slightly questionable decision, because you really should avoid pawn advances on the side of the board where you're weaker. Black is certainly under pressure on the king side, and really should consider very carefully any pawn advance at all made on this side of the board. Well, white leapt in now to the weakened g5 square with the move knight g5. Black brought his other rook now to f8. Black well and truly on the defensive now. White kept on, with f5, breaking open Black King's defensive position. Black played Queen a6. And as if White didn't have enough attackers, White brought his final piece that wasn't doing anything, his rook on c1 to e1, increasing the pressure now along the e file. White must have really been enjoying this game. Black could stand the tension no more, understandably. E takes f5. G takes f5. And finally, the wayward queen found her way back to the centre of action with Queen d6. I say the centre of action, but really everything's happening over on the king's side in this position. The queen's come back far too late. White now brought up even more forces with rook e to e3. Black played knight f to g8. Really, Black is curled up into a tight ball. He's just awaiting his own execution. The end was swift. F takes g6. Black played Queen f6 and resigned. He clearly had enough. If instead Black plays f takes g6, then knight takes g6. Looks to be curtains. For instance, knight takes g6, knight e6 check, and the Black King in incredible difficulty here. All in all, Black is completely busted. Black has another option apart from Queen e7. Black can play the move b6, as indeed Matthew Sadler did against me in the Crew Open of 1991. After b6, I continued with the useful move a3, stopping any knight b4 ideas. Black played bishop b7. I played rook e1, and Sadler put his bishop on f4. This can be irritating in some variations, but in this particular position, I don't think it's such a good move. It's quite easy for me to kick the bishop with the move g2 to g3 at some stage. First of all, I prevented the bishop's retreat with the move knight e5. Black played rook c8. I brought my other knight to support the knight on e5, knight f3. Black brought a defender to the king's side with knight to e7. I played queen e2. And Black played rook c7. Black's playing quite defensively at the moment. He's probably worried at some stage about a knight sacrifice on the f7 square, so he's giving that square some extra support. I played g3. Black's bishop came back to h6. And now, spotting a good square for a knight to move to, I played the move h2 to h4, with the idea of putting my other knight on g5. Sure enough, after g6, I played knight g5. Now, Black was probably worried also about sacrificial ideas with knight takes f7 in this position, followed by knight takes e6 or queen takes e6. So, Matthew elected to give his e6 pawn some extra support with the move queen c8. This also puts some pressure against the pawn on c2. I now decided that attacking on the king's side wasn't enough and started attacking on the queen's side as well. Quite a novel concept in the Colli-Zuckerts system. I played the move a3 to a4. Now, Matthew probably decided that stringent action was required at around this point, so after the moves knight f5, queen f3, he introduced some complications with the move knight to e4. Well, I don't know if Matthew saw as far as I did at this point, but if he did, I suspect he misassessed the ensuing position. I played knight takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, Black plays bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, And it seems as though black is getting the upper hand after rook takes c2 now, which is the move Matthew played. I'd seen this in advance, however, and there is a tactical problem with this move. I played the move knight c4. This traps the rook in on c2, which is left with nowhere to go. Black must give up the exchange. After rook takes b2, knight takes b2, queen c3, knight d3, queen takes b3, knight e5. White has a promising position, the exchange up. I went on to win in 56 moves. Due to the problems black has been having in the main lines, when the Kozuka has been seen in Grandmaster play, black has tried to vary at a much earlier stage. Going back to our original Kozuka position after 5b3, black plays the move queen a5 check as a disruptive move. This was played in Yusupov versus Short, Dortmund 1997. An earlier game of Yusupov's here went knight d2, but in this game, Yusupov improved with the move c3. Black played c takes d4, possibly not the best move because it releases the tension in the centre at a very early stage. White recaptured, e takes d4. Black played knight c6. White castled, and black played bishop e7. We can see black's idea in this system. What he's done is put a pawn on c3, a move that white wouldn't normally make of his own free will, so that the bishop's action on b2 will become even more stunted than is usual. However, white can still aim at a convenient moment to play the move c3 to c4, hoping to open up the diagonal for his bishop. First of all, though, Yusupov played the standard move knight e5 in this position, and Short decided, as many players do, to whip off the knight straight away. Knight takes e5. White recaptured, d takes e5, and black played knight d7. White now played an interesting move, queen g4. So he's hoping to take advantage of the weaknesses on the black king side before black can get organised and castled. Obviously, castling now would lead to a direct white attack after bishop h6. In fact, I think you'll find that move actually wins the exchange as it forces g6 in response. So, if black cannot castle, he has to find some other way of defending his pawn on g7. He played the move g7 to g6, but as we've seen before, this leads to a severe weakening of the dark squares. White followed up with the move rook e1, defending his pawn on e5. And black kicked out now, in Short's uncompromising manner, with the move h7 to h5. White played queen e2. Black was probably not comfortable with castling kingside in this position. He's made all these pawn moves on the king side. So he played king f8. At least this way his rook guards some of the critical black squares around his king. Now in his notes to the game, Yusupov suggests that white could have got a clear advantage at this point by playing the move bishop b2. The idea is that after queen c7, white plays knight d2, b6. White can now make some space for his bishop on b2 with the move c3 to c4. Not only has the diagonal become slightly more open for this bishop, but white intends to continue after a continuation such as d takes c4, knight takes c4, with pressure along the c-file, where black's queen is not very well placed. In fact, black's development altogether at this stage looks a bit haphazard. For instance, bishop b7, white plays rook c1, with the idea of bringing the knight into d6. I have to agree with Yusupov at this stage. White has a clear advantage. Black is still to complete his developments, and he's facing some quite nasty threats already. After 3e6, I think I've shown that the Cole-Zuckert system is a very dangerous attacking weapon in the right hands. We now need to look at some of Black's alternatives on move 3. These are fairly rare, but they need to be considered nevertheless. First of all, I want to consider bishop g4. I'll then consider bishop f5. G6 is another move you may encounter in practice. C6. And I will examine 3c5. After 3 bishop g4, I think the most principled response for white is to try and take advantage of the bishop's absence from the queen side, in particular the square b7, which has become more vulnerable. Therefore, I recommend the move for c4, and Black has two ways of guarding his centre in this position. He can play either e6 or c6. I think e6 is a slightly more accurate move, so I will deal with c6 first. After c6, I recommend c takes d5, c takes d5, queen b3. This poses a Black a problem as to how he's going to defend his pawn on b7. If he makes the pawn move b7 to b6, he does safeguard his pawn, but he leaves himself open to attacks along the white squares, specifically after knight e5, bishop f5. Black has to be on the watch out for moves such as bishop b5 check. Black also has to be wary, should he survive the opening stage, of white ideas to control the c-file. For instance, after white plays knight c3, Black plays e6, white plays bishop d2, Black knight to d7. White will have ideas of playing at a convenient moment, perhaps now in fact, bishop a6. This guarantees white control of the c-file for the foreseeable future. All in all, b6 is a very positionally undesirable move to make. Alternatively, after c6, c takes d5, c takes d5, queen b3, Black could play queen c8. But after bishop d2, Black has to make a choice now. He could take the knight on f3 for bishop takes f3, g takes f3, e6. But a good plan for white in this position is simply again to try and take advantage of Black's exposed position on the c-file. Knight c3. Black plays knight c6 to try and cover the c-file. White's rook to c1. And white is going to increase pressure gradually on Black's position, for instance by moves such as bishop b5 and knight a4 to c5. All in all, I feel that this gives white good prospects. Black may also play queen b6 after queen b3. But I think white retains a nicer endgame edge after queen takes b6, a takes b6, knight e5, bishop f5, and knight c3. White will bring his bishop to b5, and then will set about pressurising Black's weakness on b6. After, say, e6, White will play bishop b5 check, knight d7. White will complete his development in this position with moves such as bishop d2, castles, kingside. Rook f(c)(1). And then we'll set about trying to undermine black's weaknesses on the queen side by means of moves such as knight a4. Black will have a difficult time both defending the weak b6 pawn and challenging white for control of the c-file. The alternative for black in this position is the move e6. I recommend the move queen b3. Black can, if he wishes, play the move bishop takes f3, although practice has seen this incredibly rarely. Now white can play queen takes b7 in this position, which leads to incredibly complex and interesting positions after knight d7, g takes f3, and then black can consider moves such as d takes c4 or c5. Black has some counterplay in this position, but he is a pawn down, and white does have the bishop pair. Black's counterplay comes from the fact that white's king has nowhere very safe with which to hide. If white's looking for a safer option after bishop takes f3, white can simply recapture with g takes f3. This keeps black's development to a minimum, and after, say, queen c8, white can continue as normal with knight c3. The fact that the pawn is on f3 isn't necessarily such a bad thing for white. It can help support white's advance in the centre with e3 to e4 later in the game. White has two bishops and a very interesting battle in prospect. More popular than bishop takes f3 is the move queen c8 in this position. But I think white again can get reasonable chances by playing the move knight e5. Black plays bishop f5, knight c3, black bolsters his centre with the move c7 to c6. And now a very interesting idea for white in this position is c takes d5, e takes d5, f3. White's idea, say black plays bishop e7 or bishop d6, is to play e4 on his next move. And of course black cannot capture on e4 because of the weakness of the f7 pawn. Not a very appetising position for black. Another popular way for black to play this position is bishop f5. Again, I'm going to recommend a way to take advantage of the bishop's absence from the queen side with the move c4. Black has two choices here. He can defend d5 with e6 or with c6. I will consider c6 under the later section where I consider 3c6. After e6, again I recommend the move queen b3. Black plays knight c6. It's dangerous now for white to take the pawn on b7, because after queen takes b7, black has at least a draw after the move knight b4. I'm not playing for a draw, so instead I recommend the move bishop d2. This stops black's knight from being able to come to the b4 square and poses black a real problem as to how he should defend his b7 pawn. A normal try for black might be rook b8. And now white should just complete his development. Bishop e2, black bishop e7, white castles, black castles, and white can play rook c1 in this position. I like this move because it highlights one of the deficiencies in black's setup. The knight on c6 is obstructing the pawn on c7, which would really like to come to c5 to give black good equalising chances. Black's got a bit of work to do before he can actually carry out that freeing advance in this position. I think white's for choice here. Another option for black in this position is to play move 3g6. This is quite a sneaky move. Black is hoping to get into some sort of reversed Grunfeld position after, say, it's c2 to c4. I'll show, however, a way White can combat this system without having to learn reams of theory. White should play bishop d3, as in the normal Kohl-Zuckert system, although we'll be playing a little differently this time. Black plays bishop g7. White castles. Black plays c5. And now that Black's bishop is committed to the h8-a1 diagonal, I advise blocking it out with the move c2 to c3. Black has to be a little careful now. White may in some circumstances be able to take the pawn on c5 and hang on to it with the move b2 to b4. So I think most of your opponents will play the move knight d7 in this position. White plays knight d2. Black now has a choice. Black can either castle kingside immediately, or Black can play queen c7. The difference between these two is that after castles kingside, White can make the move b2 to b4. If Black takes, c takes b4, White recaptures, c takes b4. If we now look at this bishop on g7, we can see that the only significant part it can play in the game now is if Black achieves the advance e7 to e5, but this will lead, after an exchange of pawns, to an isolated pawn on d5, which White can seek to exploit later in the game. He's well placed, for instance with his bishop on b2. He can then blockade it with knight b3 to d4. After b4, Black could try b6, but then I think White should increase the pressure on the queen side with b takes c5. Black plays b takes c5, queen a4, and White will continue with moves such as bishop a3, rook b1. White has a lot of pressure. Black still has to solve all of his opening problems. Black can try the move queen to c7 in this position. However, I don't think this really interferes with White's plan. I recommend b4 anyway. This could catch some unsuspecting Black players out. Black reveals his idea. He plays c takes b4, c takes b4, queen c3. Well, that looks like an extremely powerful move. Black's attacking the pawn on b4, the bishop on d3, and the rook on a1. For one of my previous games, you may have noticed I'm not especially fond of my rooks, and this example is no exception. The move I'm recommending here is the move queen b3. If Black wants your rook, my advice is to let him take it. Of course, Black could play queen takes b3 in this position, but that was hardly his idea when he played the move queen c3. After knight takes b3, Black has all the same problems as before as to what to do with this bishop on g7. White's position will unravel very nicely here with bishop b2, rook c1, and hopefully some sort of infiltration on the c-file. Greedy Black players in this position will play the move queen takes rook on a1. Rather than giving Black two rooks for a queen, for example after bishop b2, queen takes f1, king takes f1, when Black actually stands quite well, there's a much sneakier move at White's disposal here. One that quite a few of your opponents may overlook. It's the move bishop b1 in this position. This stops Black's queen from being able to take the rook on f1, and White's next move is more likely than not to be the move bishop b2, well and truly trapping Black's queen in the corner. Black has the option of playing 3c6 in this position, and against this I'm recommending the move 4c4. Now Black has a couple of options. Black can move his bishop outside of his pawn chain by moving bishop f5 or bishop g4. We considered bishop g4 in this position earlier, so I will concentrate on bishop f5. Or black can try and reach some sort of semi-Slav type structure with the move e7 to e6. First, I'm going to concentrate on the move bishop f5. White should play c takes d5 in this position. It makes sense for black to recapture with the pawn. And now white plays queen b3. If black plays queen b6 here, again we should exchange queens and seek to take advantage of black's compromised pawn structure on the queen side in the way we highlighted earlier. Black's most popular move at this juncture is queen c7. This defends the pawn on b7 and also attacks bishop on c1 at the same time. White's best move in this position is bishop b5 check. Now black really wants to interpose with the knight on c6. If black plays knight bd7, it's very likely that he'll find his queen harassed after white's played bishop d2, knight c3 and rook c1. The queen's just going to have to move again, and white's building up quite a nice initiative on the queen side. Black should interpose knight c6. Here white's most accurate move is bishop d2. Black plays e6. And now the most constructive move for white is the move bishop b4. This seeks to hinder black from castling kingside. Black plays bishop takes b4. Check. Notice, if instead black plays bishop d6, white simply piles on the pressure with queen a3 in this position, with a likely transposition. Black will likely play bishop takes b4 check, white queen takes b4, queen e7. Black doesn't mind his king being in the centre as long as he's in an endgame. Bishop takes c6 check. B takes c6. Queen takes e7 check. King takes e7. And knight c3. As a Slav player, I've been on the receiving end of this a number of times myself as black, and I can tell you, black's task here is an uphill struggle. White has a very simple plan that is quite hard to combat. What white will do is bring his rook to c1, his knight to a4 and potentially c5, his other knight can come into e5, and white tends to build up at his leisure with moves such as b3, stopping any black attacks from, for instance, rook b8, and then doubling on the c-file. White's position is very pleasant to play, and black is left struggling, groping around trying to find equality. Black has the option, after 4c4, of trying to transpose to a semi-Slav with 4e6. I would recommend that you don't try to take the semi-Slav on, especially if you don't have enough time for opening study. Instead, I'm going to recommend a simple line for white to play, but one that's been very, very effective in practice. The fact that white's knight is not yet on c3 gives white some extra options. The move white should play in this position is knight b1 to d2. Black could respond with knight b8 to d7, as he would normally in a semi-Slav. But white now plays the move b3. Black bishop to d6. White bishop to b2. The net effect of this is that white is going to get his Colli-Zucchius system in, but usually with a tempo more. For instance, after castles, bishop d3, b6, white castles, bishop b7, plays knight e5. White has a normal Collie-Zuccourt system, but black is going to have had to waste a move with the move c6 to c5 if he's to try and get any meaningful counterplay against white's centre. This leads to an advantage for white. Black's final option in this position is the move c7 to c5. This is an awkward move to meet as a Collie-Zuccourt player, because the natural move b3 can be met by bishop g4, developing the bishop outside of the potential pawn chain and putting pressure against white's position. I'm not advocating this response, although you can play this if you wish. Instead, after 3c5, I'm recommending d takes c5. White's idea here is to get a queen's gambit accepted, reversed, under favourable conditions. Black really has two main responses to this move. The first is e6, and the second is queen a5 check, immediately regaining the pawn. After e6, white could play a move like c4, which would aim to transpose to the queen's gambit accepted with an extra move. This is a fully playable response. Interesting, though, is the move b4 in this position, trying to hold on to the pawn. Against a normal type of black approach, such as bishop e7 or knight b d7, white will be able to hang on to the pawn by means of bishop b2, a3, and perhaps later will break back with c4, with an extra pawn and an excellent position. So, after the move b4, black really must take steps now in order to try and recapture his pawn. Probably the best move for black is the move a7 to a5, undermining white's queenside. White should respond with c3. And again, black has to be accurate here. Black should play a takes b4 before white gets a chance to play bishop b2. C takes b4. b6. A very aggressive idea for white here is bishop b5 check. Now, black again has to be careful in this position. If either knight interposes on d7, for instance, knight b d7, then c6 is the end of the road for black. White will be winning at least a piece because the knight cannot move away from d7. For instance, knight back to b8, c7, check, winning black's queen. The fact that black can take white's pawn on b4 with check makes absolutely no difference. So, after bishop b5 check, black has to interpose with the bishop. Bishop d7. White should play bishop takes d7 check, knight takes d7, a4. Black regains his pawn with b takes c5, and white plays b5. This is taken from a similar idea in the Queen's Gambit accepted proper. White's idea will be to utilise his queenside pawn majority. He does have two connected passed pawns. He will continue his development with bishop b2, castles, knight b d2, and knight b3, preparing to support the advance of his pawns. White has a very interesting battle in prospect. Returning to the position after d takes c5, black can play the move queen a5 check, ruling out any of this nonsense with b4. White should reply knight b d2, and after queen takes c5, white should prepare to set his queenside pawns in motion with the move a3. Black could respond with g6. White will play c4, striking back in the centre. Black bishop g7. White pawn to b4. Black queen will drop back probably to c7. White bishop to b2. Black castle. And I think now the move rook c1 will give white a good game. Black has continuing problems with his queen. She's going to have to move at least once more. And white has a fully developed game more or less already. Black has to deal with the threat of c4 takes d5. If black takes on c4 himself, he's just helping white with his development. Bishop takes c4. And there's a nasty threat on f7, with the rook on c1 attacking black's queen on c7.
We're now going to examine an interesting way to play against the Queen's Indian, Nimzo-Indian complex. By using a cunning Kolizukator move order, we actually avoid annoying defences black can spring, such as the Bogo Indian defence. We'll see that black still isn't out of the woods in the Queen's Indian. White gets a nice attacking game using the classical variation. By using some new analysis of my own, we're going to show how white can set up nasty attacking formations against whatever black plays.
After d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, e3. If black doesn't want to enter a normal Kolizuka system with d5, black will have to choose between a Queen's Indian setup and an attempt to get something similar to a Benoni with c5. But as we'll see, both of these moves, b6 and c5, transpose into one another quite frequently. After 3c5, for instance, white will play bishop d3. Again, d5 would lead us into a Kolizuka system. But the move b6 takes us back into Queen's Indian territory. I recommend we play the move castles in this position. The nice thing about this repertoire, if you are a Kolizuka player, is that you can do away with the need to play the move c4 at a much earlier stage. The reason this is useful is that very often black would like to bring the bishop from f8 to b4, giving an annoying check and trying to transpose into a line of the Bogo Indian. By using a Kolizuka system move order, we can actually avoid this line and get exactly the sort of line that we're looking for right from the start. So, after white castles on move 5, black will normally play bishop b7. And now, white could continue with a normal Kolizuka system, such as b3, followed by bishop b2. The reason I'm not advocating this is that the move d6 can be quite awkward for white to meet. White's knight would like to go to e5, of course, but this is impossible in this sort of position. So I'm going to recommend a more aggressive setup for white, starting with the move c4. Black is soon forced into a fundamental choice. Black can delay for one more move and play bishop e7. And white should now play knight c3. Black has to make a choice. Black can choose to castle kingside in this position, which is not a particularly good move, when I'll be recommending the continuation d5 for white. Alternatively, black can choose to play the move c takes d4, and after the recapture e takes d4, black is at another crossroads. Black can play either d6 or d5 in this position. We will be examining both. First, I'm going to look at the move castles. If black castles in this position, I recommend the move d5 for white. Now, black will take, e takes d5. White recaptures, c takes d5. If black continues with d6 in this position, black will end up in a dodgy looking Benoni type position after white plays e4. White has a very simple plan in this position. He will develop, say with bishop f4, queen d2, and then tried to push on the queen side with a3 and b4, undermining black's hold on the queen side. Returning to the position after c takes d5. Notice it's not very good in this position for black to accept the pawn with knight takes d5. In fact, it's only a temporary pawn sacrifice. White will respond knight takes d5. Black plays bishop takes d5. And now, a move familiar to all Cole-Zuckert players, bishop takes h7 check. This time we're not playing for a direct mating attack on the king, but rather for a positional advantage. Black plays king takes h7. Now queen takes d5. Black will probably continue with knight c6 in this position. Now a good plan for white here is illustrated in the game Dizdar versus Placheta, Slovakia against Croatia in 1996. Here white played bishop d2. Black put his bishop on a good diagonal with bishop f6, and now white continued with bishop c3. This is quite a clever move by white. Black cannot afford to exchange bishops in this position. If black plays bishop takes c3, white doesn't recapture, but plays queen h5 check, king g8, knight g5, with a winning attack. Black in the game played king g8, and white continued with queen h5 anyway. Still, black is unable to take on c3. So, black tried rook e8. Rook a d1, d6. White began to pile on the pressure to the weak pawn on d6 with the move rook d5. Black played g6, white played queen h6, and now white has nasty ideas involving knight g5. Black can't take the knight, of course, because of queen g7 mate. Black tried knight e5. White took, bishop takes e5. Black recaptured, bishop takes e5. And white continued his attack with knight g5 here. Black brought some cover for his king with queen f6. White played queen h7 check, king f8 forced, and f4. Black played bishop takes b2, and white played for the attack here, f5. The f-file is shortly to be blasted open. Black got his queen out of the way, and gathered a piece in the process with queen takes g5. White played f takes g6. Black harvested another pawn with queen takes e3 check. White played king h1. And with white threatening, of course, queen takes pawn on f7 mate, black tried a clever tactical resource himself, the move queen f2, although ultimately it was to prove insufficient. White played another good move now, rook from d5 back to d1. Now white really is threatening to take the queen on f2. Black, for want of alternatives, played rook e2 here. Of course, the queen can't move away. White took, takes queen. Black played rook takes rook. If black felt he had some drawing chances in the ensuing rook and bishop against queen endgame, he was sorely mistaken. The rook, after king g1, has a shortage of squares to retreat to. For instance, if the rook moves to f4, queen h6 check picks up the rook. If the rook moves to f5, g7 check picks up the rook on f5. If the rook moves back to f6, queen h8 check wins the other rook on a8. If the rook moves along the second rank, then simply queen takes pawn on f7 is checkmate. Black is completely bust. In the game Grandmaster Melaniuk vs Polzin from Lyngby 1991, Black played the move d6 in this position. White played the very natural e4. Black played a6, trying to achieve his thematic Benoni break with b6 to b5, but White put the clamps on this with a2 to a4. The bishop on b7 in this position is actually very poorly placed. Black would much rather have this bishop back on the c8 square. Black is at least 2 tempi down on normal Benoni positions, which aren't great at the best of times. Black played knight b d7. White played bishop f4. Black knight to e8. White played queen e2. And Black now got his bishop to that Benoni diagonal h8 to a1 with bishop f6. White played rook a b1. Black queen to e7. Rook f to c1. White is preparing a break on the queen side with b2 to b4. Black knight to c7. And White played b4. Black played rook a b8. If we just look at this position, we don't need to go much further. White has achieved a clear advantage out of the opening. White's plan was to take on c5, and when Black recaptured with the b-pawn, to infiltrate Black's position with knight d1 to e3 to c4 to a5. Although this plan takes time, when the knight finally arrives on a5, it causes quite a bit of damage. One of Black's major options at this stage is c takes d4. This is in fact one of his better moves. White should recapture. E takes d4. And Black now has to make a choice, really. Black's faced again by the threat of d4 to d5. So he can either play d7 to d5 or d7 to d6, with the idea of meeting d4 to d5 with e6 to e5. First of all, let us consider d7 to d6. Well, White should plough on with the move d4 to d5. If Black takes on d5, White simply recaptures and has the advantage with extra space in the centre, and the pawn on d5 serving to have a cramping effect on Black's game. Black's bishop on b7 again not very well placed in this variation. This hasn't been seen too often in practice, not surprisingly. One recent game where this was seen was the all-grandmaster clash Jakovic versus Keith Arkle, Hastings 1994. Their game continued. Black castles. White played knight d4. Notice Black really still can't take on d5, because after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5. Well, White has a pleasant choice. He can play bishop takes h7 check, followed by queen h5, or perhaps even stronger, the immediate queen h5 in this position. Both moves lead to a significant White advantage. Black continued then, knight b d7. And Jakovic didn't wait to be asked. He ploughed in knight to c6. This is a very good move, seeking, after the exchange of Black's bishop on b7, to highlight the weakness of the White squares in Black's position. White already has a clear advantage. After bishop takes c6, more or less forced, D takes c6. Knight b8 is a pretty pathetic square for the knight. Probably Keith was worried about ideas of bishop a6 by white. White played queen a4, d5, bishop f4, developing with tempo. White now threatening c6 to c7, of course. Bishop d6. White created another threat with bishop g5. Black played h6. Bishop takes f6. Queen takes f6. Black is suffering all the while here because of this real thorn in his side, the pawn on c6. Really stopping Black from completing his queenside development. White played rook a e1. Black bishop back to c7. Black now attacking the pawn on c6, but unfortunately the pawn on d5 is hanging, and after knight takes d5, Black's got a lot of problems. Black played queen d6. White played knight takes c7. Queen takes c7. Black is in effect playing without his queenside pieces. Rook c1, a6, queen e4, g6. This is just pure punishment for Black. He's a pawn down, he can hardly move his queenside pieces. Really, already he could resign, but he's probably carrying on out of inertia. Returning to the position after d5, Black's best move is probably to sidestep this with the move e6 to e5. White's most aggressive response now is the move knight g5, making way for the advance of the f-pawn with f2 to f4, attacking Black's centre. Black really has three responses here. Black can play either knight b d7, reinforcing his centre. Black can play h6 to kick away the knight on g5. And Black can play castles kingside. First we're going to look at knight b d7. The move f4 in this position. Black now should probably castle, but after f5, White has a pleasant position. White has stopped Black from expanding with f7 to f5 any stage himself, and can now look to control the e4 square with a minor piece, for instance knight g5 to e4. White can then seek to utilise his queenside pawn majority, gradually rolling them up the board. Black in the game Zsua Polgar versus Horacek played the move g6 in this position. White continued naturally enough with f5. Black played h6. And now the strong grandmaster was rocked by the move knight from g5 to e6, planting the knight firmly in Black's defences. You can imagine how Black must have felt, thinking that the knight would retreat to a square like e4, and suddenly you find yourself faced by it on e6. Black panicked in this position. Probably the best move for Black would be queen c8, according to Polgar's notes. Then White should continue with queen a4, but Black's in real trouble anyway. Black's king is stuck in the centre, and the intention is clear. White wants to play f takes g6 with a huge advantage next move. To counter this, Black might try g5, but then White's other knight gets in on the act with the move knight b5, threatening knight b5 to c7, creating complete and utter chaos. In fact, this move wins black's queen. Polgar analyses in this position. F takes e6. F takes e6. Knight c5. Knight takes d6 check. King d8. Knight f7 check. King c7. Queen c2. Certainly a very nice position to play for white. White has 2 pawns to the piece at the moment. Black's king is still not secure. White has a magnificent pawn chain from c4 to e6, keeping most of black's pieces at bay. To boot, the pawn on e5 is extremely weak and likely to fall in the near future. White has a clear advantage. In the game, Horacek panicked. He played f takes e6. Polgar recaptured, f takes e6. White is now attacking the knight on d7 and the pawn on g6. Black could play in this position knight c5. But then bishop takes g6 check. King f8. b4. Leaves black's knight severely short of squares. After knight a6, white will play knight e4. Black's in serious trouble. For instance, king g7, knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, queen g4. Black is almost defenceless against white's numerous threats. Black played then knight f8. This guards the pawn on g6, but leaves black vulnerable in a different area of the board. White took immediate advantage. Queen a4 check. Well, black doesn't really have a choice. Black has to interpose on d7 with a piece, either now or after b5, queen takes b5. He chose to do it now. He played knight from f6 to d7, so at least he's still guarding his pawn on g6. White played a very accurate move now. White played the move c5. This is very cunning. If black plays, for instance, b takes c5, then e takes d7 check, and black is completely bust. For instance, knight takes d7, bishop takes g6 is checkmate. If after e takes d7, queen takes d7, bishop b5, wins the black queen. So c5 is a pawn black dare not take. Black tried bishop c8, and after e takes d7 check, saw no reason to continue the game. Queen takes d7 and knight takes d7 fail for the same reasons as before, and if bishop takes d7, then c6 wins another piece for white, returning the piece on e6 with interest, because the bishop cannot move away. For instance, bishop g4, c7 check. Black's queen is attacked, black's in check. The only way to save both is queen d7. But now again, bishop b5 wins the queen yet again. Black, a strong grandmaster, had clearly had enough. Going back to the position after knight g5, black can also play castles in this position. And after f4, in order to stop white from playing the move f5, which we've seen is quite strong, black can take on f4. E takes f4, bishop takes f4. Now in the game Carsten Hoy against Nielsen, Gauzdal 1989, Black continued with knight b d7. White built up with queen f3. Black played rook e8 to enable another defender to come to the king side. White swung his queen to h3. And Black brought his knight back to f8, defending against the threat on h7. White played rook a e1, continuing the attacking build-up. Black a6. Bishop back to d2. White is awaiting events on the king side. Black now offered a queen exchange with queen c8. White, obviously not interested in such an attacking position, played queen h4. And now Black decided it was time to kick the knight from g5. He played h6. However, this probably did not have the desired effect, because White, instead of retreating the knight, lunged in with knight takes f7. With so many pieces pointing towards the Black king, it was perhaps a little foolish of Black to weaken his king's position, although understandable. Well, Black really must accept the knight. King takes f7. And White offered another piece with bishop takes h6. White's prepared to sacrifice like this in order to completely expose the Black king. Well, Black took this as well with g takes h6. And White crashed through, forcing resignation with his next move. Rook takes e7 check. Black resigns. If king takes e7, queen takes f6 check, king d7, bishop f5 check, is murder for Black. If rook takes e7, White plays queen takes f6. Now, if king e8, queen takes f8, followed by bishop f5, wins Black's queen. If king g8, simply queen takes e7. Leaves White 2 pawns up with a devastating attack on Black's king. Black is defenceless against the threat of rook takes f8 check, queen takes f8, and queen h7 checkmate. Another alternative for Black in this position is h6, putting the question to the knight straight away. White should continue knight g5 to e4. Black captures, knight takes e4. White recaptures, knight on c3 takes e4. Black has a couple of choices here. Black can prepare to kick White's knight from the centre with g6 followed by f5, or he can simply put his king to safety by the move castles. This is the move I want to examine first. After castles, White should sound the attack with the move queen h5. We are now following, for a small part, the game Berg versus Wards, London 1989. Black played knight d7, and as usual in this variation, White didn't need asking twice. He sacrificed bishop takes h6. I think this is quite a promising piece sacrifice. Well, Black really must take, otherwise he's going to be simply a pawn down for nothing. G takes h6. Queen takes h6. White has some nasty threats lurking on the h7 square. So, understandably, Black played f5. White played queen g6 check, king h8, And now, instead of the move f4 as played in the game, I'm going to recommend a different attacking approach for white. One that I think bears greater chance for success. The move I will recommend here is the move Knight G3. This puts black's f5 pawn under fire. If black tries to blot out the white bishop with e4, for example, white will play knight takes f5, now threatening mate on g7. Black could play rook takes f5. Now bishop takes e4 is a very strong move for white. What's going to happen here is black can stave off mate in the short term, for instance with a move such as knight f8, but when white captures the rook, queen takes f5, white in this position has 4 pawns, count them, and a rook for 2 pieces. Black's king is still severely exposed. I'd say white has a winning advantage in this position. As castling kingside seems to get black into hot water, perhaps a more principled approach at this stage is g6, preparing f5. I think white should meet this head on, seeing as black hasn't castled yet, with the move f4. And after the likely response, f5 by black. Remember, if black doesn't play f5, then he gives white the opportunity to do so himself. So f5. White should bite the bullet and play f takes e5 in this position. This gives very, very interesting play. If, for example, f takes e4, then bishop takes e4. I think is quite promising for white. D takes e5, perhaps, for black. Otherwise, e6 will be a major thorn in black's side, as in the Polgar game. So D takes e5. Bishop takes g6 check. King d7 is forced. And now another very annoying move for black to have to face, d6. Black's in quite a bit of trouble in this position. If bishop takes d6, for instance, white comes crashing through with rook f7 check. If king c6, yet another mate, queen d5 checkmate. If king e6, queen g4 is checkmate. If king c8, bishop f5 gives white a completely winning position. Finally, I'll let you work out the answer to king e8. Returning to the position after f takes e5, we've seen what will happen to black should he accept the piece with f takes e4. Therefore, in Dana against Seagal, the Swiss Championship in 1993, black opted for d takes e5 in this position. White played knight g3, limbering up a possible sacrifice on f5. After knight g3, castling is impossible for black because of bishop takes h6, winning an important kingside pawn. So in the game, black continued bishop c8, trying to give some desperately needed support to the pawn on f5, but it wasn't enough, unfortunately. White crashed through. Knight takes f5. G takes f5. Queen h5 check. King d7. Obviously the king doesn't want to come to the f-file, which is just about to be opened. Rook takes f5. The king headed for the hills. King c7. And after rook takes e5, I'll finish my analysis here, saying white, again, has very dangerous attacking possibilities. We can see white's bishop is likely to come to the f4 square, the other rook will join the attack via either e1 or f1. Black's development is in disarray. His king is in a terrible predicament. Nice advantage for white. Before we leave completely the systems of defence where black plays d6 within the Queen's Indian, I want to approach the position from a more sophisticated move order from black's point of view. After d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, e3, c5, bishop d3. Black can choose at this moment to take the pawn on d4, with c takes d4. We recapture, e takes d4. Black plays b6. Castles. Now black can refrain from putting the bishop on b7 for the foreseeable future. He might play, for instance, d6. We play c4. Bishop e7, knight c3, black castles. Black's idea when he does this is that when he meets d5 with e5, his bishop is actually on a better square now, back on its starting post on c8. So I'm going to suggest that we don't rush with d5 in this position. I think we should wait for the move bishop b7 before we play the move d5 ourselves. Therefore, I'm going to recommend rook e1 in this position. Now black can delay bishop b7, but not forever. Say black plays bishop b7 now. He's achieved something by doing things this way round. After we play d5, e5, the plans with knight g5 now are not quite as convincing as before. This is because black is in a position after, say, h6, knight e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, to play f5. Before this wasn't possible because black's king was still in the centre, but here black can follow up with a quick e4 and hope to grab the initiative. Returning to the position after e5 by black, I think white should take a more circumspect approach. White should play a3, preparing a queenside pawn push. This is, after all, where white has a majority of pawns. After a3, black could continue a5. White plays rook b1. Knight e8. Black has ideas of his own on the king side. We stop those for the time being with queen c2. Black plays g6, defending against the threat on h7 and preparing again the f5 pawn push. Bishop h6 for white. Black plays knight g7. And now we should get on with things on the queen side with b4. I think black refrained from the move f5 in this position because of the response b takes a5, giving black two choices. Black could play e4, but then bishop takes g7, king takes g7, knight d4, e takes d3, knight e6 check, king g8, queen takes d3. And I think here we have a position where black is about to lose the rook on f8, and the b6 pawn is also terminally weak in this position. For instance, after queen e8, knight takes f8, queen takes f8, rook takes b6. White has very, very good activity in this position. Although black has two pieces for the rook at the moment, With the possible manoeuvre knight b5 to d4 to e6, white can claim some advantage in this position. If after b takes a5, rook takes a5, then queen b3 is very annoying pressure for black to deal with. There's no real time for e4 now. Besides bishop takes g7, white has queen b6. If black continues, queen takes b6. Rook takes b6. Black still has a number of problems in this position. His bishop on b7 is en prise. Even if he was able to take on either d3 or f3 in this position, his bishop on e7 would be attacked. On top of this, white still has the plan of bishop takes g7, and after a recapture, knight d4, highlighting the weakness of the e6 square. I'm following the game Chekhov-Bariev now, from Kharkov 1985, where black played knight d7. White continued queen e2. Black played bishop a6, putting pressure on white's pawn on c4, of course. White played rook b to c1. Black increased the pressure with rook c8. White now played knight a4. Black rook to e8. And white took on a5. B takes a5. B takes a5. And just at the moment that it looks like black's about to play the move f7 to f5 to some effect, white undermined the pawn on e5 with the move c4 to c5. Very thematic. After bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, knight takes c5, knight takes c5, rook takes c5, rook takes c5, d takes c5, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, rook takes e5. White had the better endgame. White proceeded with a plan involving knight d2 to c4, and in this sort of position, especially after a rook exchange, which duly happened, white has the better chances. Queen and knight are a very good combination, and with the passed pawn on d5, white managed to win the game. After c takes d4, e takes d4. Black's major alternative to d6 is to play d5 himself. Now white should take. C takes d5. Black could recapture with a pawn in this position, e6 takes d5, but to do so really wouldn't be a very good idea. White would simply build up with rook e1, bishop f4 or bishop g5. The bishop on b7 for black is looking a very sorry piece indeed. This doubtless is not black's idea when he plays the move d5. After c takes d5, black should play knight takes d5. This leaves clear the diagonal from a8 to h1. I recommend knight e5 in this position for white. This frees the way for the queen to enter the attack. Black will normally castle, otherwise black has to face the danger of a bishop b5 check. So black castles, and white plays the move queen g4 in this position. This is quite a nice attacking move for white. At the moment, white has ideas such as bishop h6. If black was to play bishop f6 in response, then queen e4 is very nasty for black. White is threatening the pawn on h7, and the only way for black to prevent white from taking this is g6, which will then lose the rook on f8. In this position, many black players choose to bring back a key defender of the king side with the move knight f6. Against this, I recommend the move queen h4, which, innocent looking as it is, sets a number of lethal traps. I will consider 3 alternatives for black. I will look at knight e4, knight d7, and knight c6. Starting with knight c6, move I recommend for white here is bishop g5. This was played in a game Plaskett Arkle 1991. In fact, after bishop g5, surprisingly, we're barely out of the opening. White already has a near decisive attack. White is threatening. Bishop takes f6. Black recaptures. And then again, queen takes h7. Checkmate. If black plays h6 in this position, black's still in trouble. After bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, the move queen e4 is a killing double attack against the knight on c6 and a mate threat on h7. This leaves black with a severe lack of alternatives for defending his kingside. The move Arkle chose in the game was g6, which seems natural enough, but meets with a very nice refutation. White played the surprising looking move bishop a6, leaving the bishop en prise. However, black cannot take this gift. If bishop takes a6, white plays knight takes c6. This is killing for white. Black's queen has to move. Then knight takes e7 check. Queen takes e7. Bishop takes f6. To add insult to injury, white is going to follow up with a quick queen h6 and queen g7 checkmate. In the game, Arkle tried h6 for lack of alternatives. White simply continued bishop takes h6. Black knight came to d5. Queen retreated to h3. Black tried knight takes c3. Bishop takes b7. Knight e2 check. King h1. Knight takes d4. Bishop takes f8. Bishop takes f8. Bishop takes a8. One exchange is not enough for Gem. Queen takes a8. Queen e3. White had a completely winning position. 2 exchanges up. Black tried the move knight b d7 in the game Zissou Polgar against Christensen, San Francisco 1991. White continued rook d1. Black played knight e4, attacking against white's queen, which dropped back to the h3 square. Black brought his other knight to f6 to defend the kingside. And white's now played quite a spectacular looking move. d4 to d5. White is seeking to exploit a potential pin along the d file. Black played knight takes c3. B takes c3. Bishop takes d5. White now played bishop g5, threatening to take on f6 and then h7. So black played g6. White's queen to h4, building up the pressure. Black's in a very serious position here. White also threatens c4 in this position. So black tried h6. Desperation. White crashed through. Bishop takes g6. F takes g6. Queen takes h6. Knight h7. Queen takes g6 check. King h8. Bishop takes e7. Queen takes e7. c4, with the idea that if the bishop moves, say bishop b7, white will play the move rook d7, which is really the end for black. So after c4, black tried queen h4, but now c takes d5, queen takes f2 check. Finally, we have a check for black in one of our variations, but don't worry, it's not a very important one. King h1, rook f6, queen e4, e takes d5, queen takes d5. Black tried rook g8, but after h3, white had a clear advantage in this position. White's a pawn up, and black's king is significantly exposed here. The final move I want to look at here is the move knight e4, which as far as I can see is a drawing attempt by black. Black is hoping for queen g4, knight back to f6, queen h4. In fact, a couple of games on my database have gone this way, but I don't think white needs to play so conservatively. After knight e4, I recommend the move queen h3 in this position. At first sight this looks risky, because black can play in this position the move queen takes d4. But now white has a tactical shot. White should play knight takes pawn on f7. It looks like a strange move, but after rook takes f7, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, white plays queen g4 in this position. I have to admit, Fritz helped me to spot this one. After queen g4, white is regaining the piece on e4, and after, say, a move such as knight d7 by black, queen takes e4, queen takes e4, knight takes e4. White is doing well in the resulting endgame. Black has a weak pawn on e6 for white to target, and white has a nice square on e4 to place his pieces. White is better. The final possibility for black at this point is the move d5. I'm going to offer a simple remedy for this. I think your opponents are unlikely to play this move because it's not really in the spirit of the Queen's Indian. I recommend taking on d5. C takes d5. If black recaptures with the knight, he has to reckon with the possibility of white playing e3 to e4, building up a strong centre. I think having played d5, black is more likely to recapture with the pawn. e6 takes d5. And now I think we should follow with a fianchetto, reminiscent of the Cole Zukertort system, with b3. Black will probably castle. We'll play bishop b2. Our idea, if black ever captures on d4, is to recapture with the knight, reaching a favourable isolated queen pawn position. If black first increases the pressure with the move knight c6, then I recommend knight e2 in this position, keeping a firm grip on the d4 square. White will continue with moves such as rook c1, queen c2, rook f d1. Perhaps the queen will come back to b1 to move out of the way. White has a very nice solid position, and at a later stage can play d takes c5, and however black recaptures, seek to gain the advantage. For instance, b takes c5, white will play against the hanging pawns, and bishop takes c5, white again has a nice isolated pawn position. I think you're unlikely to face this line often in practice. Queen's Indian players tend to prefer their pawn structures to be a bit more fluid than this, but if you do, this is a simple and effective counter.
By adopting a Cole Zukertort move order, we cut out some major black options in the Nimzo Indian and Queen's Indian defence complex. The fact that Super Grandmaster and World Championship candidate Arthur Yusupov regularly uses both these systems attests to their soundness. I wish you a happy king hunting.